Just 5 minutes into my 28th birthday party, my sister threw my custom red velvet cake onto the hardwood floor and told me to pick it up and eat it. I did not say a single word. That night, my mother sent a harsh text message stating that we were done and I was no longer a part of the family. I calmly replied that I would be removing my name from everything the next morning. Before midnight even arrived, my phone screen illuminated with 119 missed calls. Let me tell you how the toxic family that constantly treated me like an absolute burden ended up begging for my mercy when their fake empire began to crumble. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you are watching from today. The rich mahogany floors of my parents' lavish estate in Prince George County, Maryland, were supposed to be kept absolutely pristine for the upcoming country club gala they were hosting. Instead, those highly polished floors were now completely covered in smashed red velvet cake and thick cream cheese icing. The loud, sickening splat of the three-tier cake hitting the ground instantly silenced the soft, elegant jazz music that had been playing through the expensive surround sound speakers in the background. My sister Chantel stood directly over the ruined dessert. At 31 years old, she was the undisputed golden child of our family, and she carried herself with a toxic entitlement that seemed to consume the oxygen in every room she entered. She crossed her arms tightly across her chest, causing the massive diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist to catch the light from the crystal chandelier hanging above us. With a deliberate and malicious movement, she scraped the pointed toe of her designer heel straight into the crushed icing, spreading the red stain further across the floor. "Pick it up and eat it, Desiree," she demanded, her voice slicing through the thick, uncomfortable silence of the massive living room. I stood completely still, my heart pounding heavily in my chest. It was my 28th birthday. I had baked that beautiful cake myself, spending hours in my own kitchen, measuring and mixing, because absolutely no one else in my family had bothered to remember the date or order a cake for me. Around us, 24 well-dressed guests, including my aunts, my uncles, and my parents' wealthy country club associates, paused awkwardly with their expensive champagne flutes hovering near their mouths. The tension in the room was palpable, but not a single person stepped forward to intervene or defend me. They all just watched, waiting to see how much more humiliation I could take. The suffocating quiet was suddenly broken by a sharp and mocking chuckle. It came from Spencer. Spencer was Chantel's white husband and the newly appointed chief financial officer of my father's logistics company. He took a slow, arrogant sip of his expensive bourbon and shook his head with a deeply amused smirk on his face. "Come on, Chantel," he chuckled, his tone dripping with condescension. "Do you not think Desiree is humiliated enough just wearing that cheap off-the-rack dress to a high society party like this? Making her eat food off the floor is just cruel and unusual punishment." He looked around the room as if expecting the guests to join in his cruel laughter. My fingernails bit into my palms so hard that the skin threatened to break and bleed. I slowly shifted my gaze away from my sister and looked directly at my parents, expecting some sort of intervention or basic parental protection. My father, Winston, a man who walked around like he owned the entire eastern seaboard, simply because he ran a moderately successful medical supply chain company, just stood there. He calmly adjusted his silk tie and checked his gold watch. His face remained completely impassive, as if a minor insect had just been squashed on his beautiful floor and it was entirely beneath his attention to care. And then there was my mother, Brenda. She finally stepped forward, breaking away from a group of her socialite friends. But she did not step forward to reprimand her spoiled golden child. She did not raise her voice at Chantel or demand an apology for the ruined birthday cake. Instead, my mother walked right up to me and forcefully shoved a thick wad of paper cocktail napkins against my chest. "Desiree, what on earth is wrong with you?" my mother hissed, keeping her voice low but incredibly venomous so the guests would not hear her profanity. "Why are you always going out of your way to antagonize your sister? You know perfectly well that she is extremely stressed out about hosting the charity gala tomorrow evening, and Spencer just closed a major account for your father's business. Clean this disgusting mess up right now before it permanently stains my custom Persian rug. You are embarrassing us in front of our most important guests." I looked down at the crumpled napkins in my hand, Then I looked up at the triumphant, vicious smirk plastered across Chantel's face. For 28 long years, this had been the exact script our family followed. If I earned a prestigious college scholarship, Chantel would suddenly have a massive meltdown about her skin breaking out or her boyfriend ignoring her, and my academic achievement would be instantly silenced and forgotten. If I bought a new car with my own hard-earned money, Spencer would inevitably make a condescending joke about my interest rate, and my father would laugh along with him, validating the disrespect. And now the birthday cake I had made to celebrate my own existence was literal garbage on the floor. I did not shed a single tear. The deep reservoir of my patience had completely evaporated along with the crushed icing on the floor. I dropped the cocktail napkins directly into the sticky puddle of red frosting. I locked eyes with my mother, keeping my voice dead calm and absolutely steady. "I am not your maid," I said, my words ringing clearly across the quiet room. "And that precious Persian rug you are so incredibly worried about ruining. You bought that rug on the premium credit card that I pay the monthly bill for." I turned on my heel and walked straight toward the heavy oak front door. I ignored the sudden dramatic gasp from my aunt standing near the entryway, and I completely tuned out the furious high-pitched shout from Chantel, who could never handle being spoken to with disrespect. I walked out into the cool evening air, leaving behind the opulent mansion and the deeply toxic people inside it. The long drive back to my downtown condo was quiet and reflective. The bright city lights blurred past my car window as I gripped the steering wheel tightly. I thought about how I had spent my entire adult life trying to earn a permanent place at their table. As a highly successful private equity manager, I handled hundreds of millions of dollars for high net worth clients across the country. I was brilliant at my demanding job, respected by my industry peers, and completely financially independent. Yet within the walls of my family home, I was just the quiet, dark-skinned daughter who did not fit their superficial image of black excellence. They desperately wanted the flashy aesthetic of success, which Chantel and her loud husband Spencer provided effortlessly, while I was simply the reliable workhorse they kept hidden in the background to handle the heavy lifting. At exactly 10 o'clock that night, my phone buzzed loudly on my nightstand. It was a text message from my mother, Brenda. "We are done," she wrote. "You are an absolute embarrassment to this family. Your behavior tonight was unacceptable, selfish and purely jealous. You are not a part of this family anymore. Do not bother coming to the gala tomorrow or ever again. We do not want to see your face." I stared at the glowing screen, reading the harsh words over and over again. There was no crying. There was no desperate urge to call her and beg for forgiveness or understanding. Instead, a profound and overwhelming sense of peace washed over my entire body. I calmly walked over to my home office desk and opened my secure laptop. I logged into my private banking portal and pulled up the highly classified corporate accounts for my father's logistics company. My family thought I was just a quiet, boring numbers girl who sat in a cubicle all day. They had conveniently forgotten a very crucial and expensive piece of information. 5 years ago, when Winston's supply chain business was on the absolute brink of total collapse due to his arrogant mismanagement, he desperately needed a massive corporate loan to keep his operations afloat. He could not secure the funding on his own because his debt-to-income ratio was terrible. He needed a highly qualified co-signer with a flawless credit history and significant hidden equity to back the massive loan. He needed the specific daughter he openly despised. I had signed the legal paperwork for a $5 million corporate line of credit, basically saving his entire empire from absolute ruin. My signature and my financial backing were the only things standing between him and complete bankruptcy. I picked up my phone and typed my final reply to my mother. "Understood," I wrote simply. "I am removing my name from everything tomorrow morning. Have a great gala." I hit send and tossed the phone onto the bed. I spent the next hour walking around my spacious condo, taking down the few framed family photos I had foolishly kept on display. In every single picture, I was standing on the far edge of the frame, half cropped out, while Chantel and my parents beamed brightly in the center. I threw them all directly into the trash bin where they belonged. I was no longer going to hold up the foundation of a house that continuously refused to give me shelter. I woke up the next morning to the cheerful sound of my alarm. The bright sunlight was streaming beautifully through my floor-to-ceiling windows. I stretched my arms, feeling significantly lighter and freer than I had in a decade. I rolled over and picked up my phone to check the morning news. The screen was absolutely flooded with desperate notifications. 119 missed calls. 74 from my father Winston. 45 from my arrogant brother-in-law Spencer. My text message inbox was a chaotic stream of demands, threats, apologies, and outright panic. The heavy pounding on my front door started exactly at 6:00 in the morning. It was not the polite knock of a visitor or a neighbor. It was a violent, desperate sound that vibrated through the thick oak wood and echoed down the quiet hallway of my luxury condominium building. I was already awake, sitting at my kitchen island with a cup of black coffee, watching the early morning sunlight reflect off the polished granite countertops. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the warm liquid, letting the rich, bitter taste ground me. The pounding grew louder, accompanied by the muffled sound of my father demanding that I open the door immediately. His voice, usually so composed and authoritative, was thick with panic and rage. I did not rush. I tightened the belt of my silk robe, walked barefoot across the cool hardwood floor, and paused for a moment to look through the peephole. Winston Hayes stood in the hallway looking like a man whose entire universe was actively collapsing. His custom-tailored suit jacket was wrinkled, and his silk tie was hanging loosely around his neck. He was sweating profusely despite the cool, climate-controlled air of the building corridor. I unlocked the deadbolt with a loud metallic click and pulled the door open just enough to face him, while keeping my body firmly blocking the entrance. "What did you do, Desiree?" he demanded, his chest heaving as he tried to push his way inside. I held my ground, refusing to let him cross the threshold of my sanctuary. The bank just called me in an absolute panic and told me that our primary guarantor officially withdrew her backing. They issued an immediate margin call on our $8 million line of credit. "What on earth did you do to the company accounts?" I looked at him with absolute calm. My heart was not racing. My hands were not shaking. For the first time in my 28 years of life, I felt no fear or intimidation when looking at my father. I took another sip of my coffee and swallowed before answering him in a steady, quiet voice. "I did exactly what your wife told me to do." "Winston," I replied, using his first name to remind him that he lost the privilege of being called Dad the moment he let Chantel humiliate me. "My mother sent me a very clear message last night stating that I was no longer a part of your family. Since I am no longer family, it makes absolutely no financial or logical sense for me to carry the massive financial risk for your logistics company." I called my private wealth manager at 3 in the morning and initiated the complete and immediate withdrawal of my collateral. The bank is simply doing their job by demanding their money back. "You cannot do this to me!" he yelled, stepping closer until I could smell the stale bourbon on his breath from the night before. "We do not have $8 million in liquid cash sitting around to cover a sudden loan recall. The business will completely fold by the end of the week if you do not reinstate your signature and your financial backing right this second. You are going to call the bank right now and fix this massive mess that you created." I simply stared at him, marveling at the sheer audacity and entitlement of his demands. My father walked through the world acting like a self-made titan of industry. He hosted charity galas, gave speeches on Black excellence, and let everyone in Prince George County believe he built his logistics empire purely through his own unparalleled genius. But the reality was far more pathetic. 5 years ago, his company was bleeding cash and teetering on the edge of total bankruptcy due to his chronic mismanagement and terrible investment choices. He needed a massive injection of capital to keep his supply chain moving. But no reputable bank was willing to loan him a single dollar, because his debt-to-income ratio was abysmal and his assets were already heavily leveraged. He needed a savior. He needed a highly qualified co-signer with a flawless credit history and significant hidden equity to back the $8 million corporate loan. He needed the specific daughter he openly despised and constantly belittled. I was a highly successful private equity manager, handling hundreds of millions of dollars for elite clients. My financial portfolio was immaculate. I had quietly used my own assets to guarantee his loan, essentially saving his entire empire from absolute ruin. My signature and my personal wealth were the only things standing between him and complete financial devastation. And for 5 years he had taken that enormous sacrifice completely for granted. "I am not fixing anything, Winston," I said, keeping my tone completely devoid of emotion. "You and Mom made it perfectly clear last night that Chantel and her husband Spencer are the real pride and joy of this family. You let Chantel throw my birthday cake on the floor and tell me to eat it like a dog. You let Spencer mock my clothes and my career while you stood there adjusting your tie. You let Mom text me and tell me I was an embarrassment. So let your golden child and her brilliant white husband figure out how to save your sinking ship. Spencer is your highly paid chief financial officer, right? Let him figure out how to magically generate $8 million in cash before the bank seizes all of your supply chain assets and legally locks the doors to your warehouses." My father ran a trembling hand over his face, his eyes wide with a mixture of fury and disbelief. He tried to push the door open again, but I braced my shoulder against the heavy wood, refusing to yield a single inch. "You listen to me, Desiree," he snarled, his voice dropping to a harsh, threatening whisper. "You owe this family. We put a roof over your head. We paid for your food. We gave you the prestigious last name that allowed you to walk into those fancy corporate offices and get your little accounting jobs. You are going to sign the reinstatement paperwork today, or I swear to you, I will destroy your professional reputation. I know people in the financial district. I can make sure you never manage another private equity fund in this state again." I could not help but smile at his empty, pathetic threats. He truly had no idea who I was or the immense power I wielded in the financial sector. He still saw me as the quiet, obedient girl who sat in the corner doing homework while Chantel demanded everyone's attention. "You do not have the power to destroy anything, Winston," I said softly, leaning slightly forward. "My reputation in the financial sector is built on actual verifiable results, not on empty boasting at country club dinners. My clients trust me because I make them millions of dollars, not because my last name is Hayes. You, on the other hand, are completely dependent on my pristine credit to keep the illusion of your wealth alive. You have been playing the role of a rich, successful patriarch, using my money to fund your extravagant lifestyle and your wife's endless shopping sprees. And now the free ride is permanently over." My father stared at me, his chest heaving, his mind desperately trying to process the fact that he no longer had any control over me. He tried to switch tactics, shifting from anger to emotional manipulation. His posture slumped slightly, and he let out a long, heavy sigh, attempting to look like a heartbroken, weary father. "Desiree, please," he said, his voice suddenly softening into a pleading tone. "Do not do this to us. Your mother is beside herself with worry. Your sister is pregnant, and the stress of losing the family business could be dangerous for the baby. We are your family. We share the same blood. You cannot just turn your back on us and watch everything we built burn to the ground over a silly misunderstanding at a party." "A silly misunderstanding," I repeated, testing the words on my tongue to see how ridiculous they sounded. "Mom told me I was no longer her daughter. She said I was dead to her." "That is not a misunderstanding, Winston. That is a declaration of severed ties. And as for your business, it is not everything we built. It is what I saved, and what you proceeded to squander. You let Spencer take over the finances because you were too intimidated by his corporate pedigree to realize he is utterly incompetent. You prioritized his white privilege over my actual proven expertise, so no, I am not going to protect you anymore." I watched the panic in his eyes morph back into defensive arrogance. He realized that guilt and manipulation were not going to work on me. He drew himself up to his full height, trying to reclaim his dominant aura. He adjusted his wrinkled suit jacket and glared at me with pure, unadulterated contempt. "You think you are so smart," he sneered, his upper lip curling in disgust. "You think you hold all the cards just because you managed to pull a fast one with the bank this morning? Well, let me tell you something, Desiree. You think you can ruin me, but you are dead wrong. Spencer has wealthy investors lining up around the block to get a piece of our logistics company. We have a crucial meeting with a highly prestigious private equity group this very afternoon. They are ready to inject massive amounts of capital into our expansion plans. We do not need your little accountant money. We will secure new funding today, and you will be left with absolutely nothing. You will just be a bitter, lonely woman sitting in a dark apartment while we continue to thrive without you." I looked him up and down, taking in his desperate bravado and his complete detachment from financial reality. He truly believed that Spencer was a genius who could magically conjure millions of dollars from thin air. He had no idea about the massive, devastating storm that was already brewing just beneath the surface of his precious company. "Good luck with those wealthy investors, Winston," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and pleasant. "I hope Spencer has a very compelling presentation prepared for them. They are going to have a lot of questions about where the operational capital actually goes." Before he could say another word, I pushed the heavy oak door closed right in his face. I heard him shout my name one last time before the thick wood cut off the sound of his voice entirely. I reached up and twisted the heavy brass deadbolt, locking it with a loud, satisfying click that resonated in the quiet foyer of my condo. I stood alone in my hallway, listening as his heavy footsteps eventually retreated down the corridor outside. The silence that followed was absolute and beautiful. I walked slowly back toward my kitchen, picking up my coffee mug from the island counter. The coffee had gone lukewarm, but I drank it anyway, savoring the deep, bitter taste. I walked over to my floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out over the waking city. The morning traffic was just beginning to build below, and the sky was turning a brilliant shade of pale blue. I thought about my father's arrogant parting words about Spencer and his supposed line of wealthy, eager investors. I let out a soft, genuine laugh that echoed in the empty room. "Let us see how Spencer's fancy investors feel when they find out about the federal wire fraud," I murmured to myself, tracing the rim of my coffee mug with my thumb. I knew exactly what my golden child sister's husband had been doing for the past 3 years. While Spencer played the role of the hotshot financial executive, taking long, expensive lunches and bragging about his corporate strategies, I had been quietly and meticulously monitoring the quarterly financial reports that my father proudly sent out to the family. As a highly trained forensic accountant whose entire career was built on spotting hidden anomalies in massive corporate structures, I noticed the glaring discrepancies almost immediately. There were regular, highly suspicious, and unexplainable transfers being made every single month from the primary operational accounts to a mysterious subsidiary shell company located in the Cayman Islands. Spencer thought he was being incredibly clever by burying the stolen funds deep inside convoluted operational expenses and fake vendor invoices. He assumed that my father was too ignorant about modern corporate finance to ever notice, and he assumed that I was too unimportant to ever look closely at the books. But Spencer was arrogant and sloppy. He left a massive digital paper trail that any competent auditor could follow with their eyes closed. He was systematically draining my father's life work, bleeding the logistics company dry, month after month, to fund his lavish secret lifestyle. He was using my family's money to pay for extravagant vacations with his mistresses, luxury sports cars hidden in private garages, and massive underground gambling debts that he could never hope to pay off legitimately. And my father was far too blinded by his desperate need for social validation and his eager adoration for his white son-in-law to ever question where the missing capital was going. Winston simply accepted Spencer's complicated financial jargon as absolute gospel, never once asking for receipts or conducting independent audits. By officially pulling my financial backing and triggering the margin call this morning, I had not just caused a temporary cash flow problem, I had purposefully forced an immediate and aggressive audit by the lending bank. The bank would demand to see every single ledger, every transaction, and every hidden account before they even considered restructuring the debt. It was an audit that Spencer could not possibly survive or manipulate his way out of. The clock was officially ticking, and the explosive truth was only hours away from detonating directly in the middle of their perfect fake lives. I took one last sip of my coffee, feeling a deep, profound sense of satisfaction settling into my bones. They had wanted me to pick up the cake and eat it off the floor. They had wanted me to bow down and accept my place as the family punching bag. Instead, I had just pulled the single thread that was going to unravel their entire magnificent delusion. I walked back to my home office and opened my laptop, my fingers hovering gracefully over the keyboard. It was time to prepare the next phase of the strategy. Spencer was going to scramble today, trying desperately to hide his tracks and secure new funding to cover the gaping holes in the ledger. And I was going to be watching every single move he made, ensuring that the federal authorities received an anonymous, beautifully organized package of financial documents at exactly the right moment. The war had only just begun, and I was holding every single weapon. The morning passed with the quiet precision of a well-executed military operation. I arrived at my corner office on the 40th floor of the financial district exactly at 8 o'clock. My firm occupied the top 3 floors of the gleaming glass tower, and the atmosphere here was nothing like the chaotic, loud energy of my father's logistics company. Here, power was silent and absolute. My assistants brought me my schedule and a fresh espresso while I settled into my leather ergonomic chair. I pulled up the digital monitors tracking the global markets and, more importantly, tracking the specific banking movements of Winston Hayes Logistics. I could see the exact moment the bank officially froze their operational accounts. The red alerts flashed across my screen, confirming that the margin call had moved from a distant threat to a harsh legal reality. I knew it was only a matter of time before Spencer figured out that his carefully scheduled meetings with the private equity investors were going to be completely useless. Wealthy investors do not inject massive amounts of capital into a company that is actively having its assets seized by a primary commercial lender. They run the other way as fast as possible. Sure enough, just before noon, my heavy glass office door was pushed open with aggressive physical force. My receptionist, a highly trained professional who usually kept unwanted visitors at bay, tried to step in his way, but Spencer shoved past her with the arrogant entitlement of a man who had never been told no in his entire privileged life. He stormed into my office, bringing the sharp smell of expensive designer cologne and desperate nervous sweat with him. Spencer stood in the center of my office, breathing heavily like a cornered animal. His face was flushed bright red, and his usually perfect blonde hair was uncharacteristically messy, falling across his forehead in damp strands. He looked around at the expansive view of the city skyline, the modern abstract art on the walls, and the pristine glass desk I sat behind. For a brief second, I saw a flicker of genuine shock in his blue eyes. My family had always aggressively downplayed my career, treating my job like it was some entry-level administrative bookkeeping position. They told their country club friends, I just crunched numbers for a living. Spencer had probably expected to find me in a tiny, windowless cubicle buried under piles of boring tax returns. But he quickly masked his surprise with a heavy scowl of pure, familiar condescension. He turned to my receptionist and barked at her to leave the room and close the door immediately because we were going to have a private family discussion. I gave my assistant a slight reassuring nod, letting her know I had the situation completely under control. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving me alone with my sister's husband. Spencer marched straight up to my desk and slammed a thick manila folder down onto the glass surface. He leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the desk, trying to physically loom over me and use his height to intimidate me. It was a classic pathetic corporate bullying tactic. He looked at me with a mixture of faux pity and intense disgust. You have made a massive, unforgivable mistake, Desiree, he said, his voice dripping with absolute venom. You think you are playing some brilliant strategic chess move by messing with your father's line of credit? But all you have done is expose yourself to massive federal legal liability. I have spent the entire morning on the phone with our corporate attorneys and our crisis management team. What you did last night constitutes a direct breach of fiduciary duty and malicious financial sabotage. I simply leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers together, and let him talk. I maintained a perfectly neutral expression. I wanted him to put all of his cards on the table before I set the entire deck on fire. Spencer took my calm silence as submission. He puffed out his chest, adjusting his wrinkled suit jacket, and continued his aggressive tirade. "You are completely emotionally unstable, Desiree. You threw a massive tantrum because Chantel embarrassed you at a stupid birthday party, so you decided to illegally manipulate corporate banking structures to get petty revenge. I am handing you a formal cease and desist order right now. If you do not call the bank this very second and reverse the withdrawal of your collateral, I am going to personally ensure that you are blacklisted from the entire financial sector. I know the senior partners at all the major investment firms in this city. I play golf with the men who run the regulatory boards. I will tell them that you are a vindictive liability who uses client leverage to settle petty family disputes. Your career will be entirely over by sunset. You will be lucky if you can find a job balancing cash registers at a local grocery store when I am done dragging your name through the mud." He spoke with the absolute, unshakable certainty of a white man who was accustomed to wielding power over black women without ever facing a single negative consequence. He had spent the last 3 years wrapping my parents around his finger, playing the role of the highly educated corporate savior who was going to take our family business to the next level of wealth. My father worshipped him because Spencer represented the kind of mainstream corporate legitimacy that Winston desperately craved but could never achieve on his own. Chantel worshipped him because his supposed wealth and status funded her ridiculous country club lifestyle and gave her bragging rights among her shallow friends. Spencer firmly believed that because he controlled my parents, he inherently controlled me. He thought his privilege was an impenetrable shield. When he finally paused to take a breath, I reached out and calmly pushed his thick manila folder off my desk. It slid across the smooth glass and fell onto the floor, landing with a soft thud, exactly the way my red velvet birthday cake had landed the night before. Spencer glared at me, his jaw tightening in fresh anger at the blatant disrespect. "You clearly do not understand what I actually do for a living, Spencer," I said, my voice incredibly low and dangerously smooth. "My family likes to tell people that I am just a standard portfolio manager who looks after basic retirement accounts. They tell themselves that comforting lie because understanding the truth would require them to actually acknowledge my intelligence and my power. I am not a standard accountant. I am a senior forensic auditor who specializes in the hostile takeover of corrupt, distressed companies. My entire professional life is dedicated to dismantling failing corporations, exposing massive financial fraud, and liquidating the remaining assets for my private equity partners. I hunt financial predators for sport." Spencer scoffed loudly, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. "Congratulations on your fancy corporate title," he mocked, rolling his eyes. "It does not change the simple fact that you breached a binding legal contract by pulling your backing from our operational loans. You are going to be sued into oblivion." I slowly opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a single crisp sheet of white paper. I placed it carefully in the exact center of the desk, right where his ridiculous folder had been. "I did not breach any contract," I explained, keeping my gaze locked on his face. "My co-signing agreement with the lending bank explicitly contained a standard fraud protection clause. It gave me the absolute legal right to withdraw my collateral immediately if I uncovered any evidence of systematic embezzlement or criminal financial mismanagement by the corporate officers of Winston Hayes Logistics." The color began to rapidly drain from Spencer's face. His arms slowly uncrossed and fell limply to his sides. The arrogant sneer on his lips began to falter. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the single sheet of paper. "I have been monitoring your quarterly financial reports for over a year, Spencer. You thought you were being incredibly sophisticated by routing stolen capital through dummy vendor invoices. You set up a ghost logistics consulting firm registered to a tiny post office box in Delaware. You authorized massive weekly payments to this fake firm for transportation management services that were never actually rendered. From there, you funneled the money through a series of complex shell companies before finally depositing it into a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands. I watched his breathing become incredibly shallow and erratic. The arrogant, untouchable swagger had completely vanished, replaced by the stark, naked terror of a man who suddenly realizes he is standing in the exact center of a live minefield. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the glass desk. I know exactly how much you stole, Spencer. I continued, my voice relentless and precise. $2.4 million over the course of 36 months. I know that you used $400,000 of that stolen corporate money to purchase a luxury penthouse condominium in Miami under a holding company name. A beautiful beachfront condominium that my sister Chantel knows absolutely nothing about, where you frequently entertain a young woman named Jessica, who works as a junior analyst at your old brokerage firm. I know that you paid off $600,000 in private gambling debts to a very dangerous syndicate operating out of Atlantic City. You bled my father's logistics company dry to fund your degenerate secret lifestyle, and you used the margin call crisis to try and push the company into a forced rapid sale so you could take your final cut and disappear before anyone noticed the missing funds. Spencer was visibly shaking now. A single heavy drop of sweat rolled down his pale temple and soaked into the stiff collar of his expensive custom dress shirt. He looked down at the sheet of paper on my desk, as if it were a loaded weapon pointing directly at his chest. His mouth opened and closed several times, but absolutely no sound came out. The brilliant, confident chief financial officer was completely paralyzed by the sheer volume of meticulous, irrefutable evidence I had just dropped on him. He reached a trembling hand up to loosen his silk tie, suddenly finding it very difficult to draw breath in the spacious air-conditioned office. "Desiree," he stammered, his voice completely devoid of its previous malice and entitlement. His tone was now high-pitched, desperate, and pleading. "Desiree, please listen to me for just 1 second. We can figure this out. We can keep this entirely between us. You do not need to show that piece of paper to the bank or the federal authorities. If Winston finds out about this, he will literally kill me. If Chantel finds out about Miami, she will destroy my entire life." He placed both of his shaking hands flat on my desk, leaning in with a look of absolute desperate panic. "What do you want?" he begged, his eyes darting frantically around the room as if searching for an escape route. "Tell me what you want, and I will make it happen today. I know your parents have treated you terribly all these years. I know they relentlessly favor Chantel. It is completely unfair, and you do not deserve it. I can talk to Winston right now. I can convince him to officially put you back in the family will. I can make absolutely sure that you get an equal share of the estate when he passes. I can ensure that you are given a massive equity stake in the logistics company once we secure the new funding from my investors. You can have a permanent seat on the board of directors. You will have the respect and the high family status you have always rightfully deserved. Just please, I am begging you, let me fix the accounts and cover the massive shortfall before the auditors arrive." I looked at him, feeling a deep, cold wave of pure disgust wash over me. He honestly thought I cared about getting a seat at a table that was actively rotting from the inside out. He truly believed that the promise of being included in a meaningless family will was the ultimate prize I had been secretly craving all these years. He was trying to toss me pathetic scraps of validation, thinking I was still a starving, wounded dog, desperately begging for my abuser's approval. I smiled at him, a cold, sharp, terrifying smile that held absolutely no mercy or forgiveness. "I do not want the will, Spencer," I said, my voice echoing softly in the pristine, quiet office. "I do not want a seat on a board of directors for a logistics company that is essentially financially worthless. You are fundamentally misunderstanding the reality of your current devastating situation. You think we are sitting here negotiating a standard corporate settlement to keep the family peace. We are not. I picked up the sheet of paper and held it up, allowing him to see the dense columns of financial data printed on it. While you were busy arrogantly stealing millions from my foolish father to pay off your massive gambling debts and fund your secret mistress, you forgot to cover your tracks with your other private lenders, I explained, watching his eyes widen in fresh terror. When you realized the offshore Cayman accounts were not going to be enough to cover your massive ballooning personal liabilities, you took out a series of high-interest predatory loans using your own personal assets as collateral. You leveraged your own marriage, your own luxury home, and your own future, thinking you could outsmart the system. Spencer stared at me, his chest heaving as the final catastrophic piece of the puzzle clicked into place in his mind. I watched the very last remaining shreds of his white corporate privilege dissolve into pure, unadulterated, paralyzing fear. I leaned back in my leather chair and looked at him with absolute total triumph. My private equity firm specializes in acquiring highly distressed high-risk debt, I told him softly, enjoying the way he visibly flinched at my words. When your predatory lenders finally realized you were never going to pay them back, they bundled your massive personal debt and put it up for public sale at a very steep discount to recoup their losses. I did not just discover your ridiculous embezzlement, Spencer. I legally purchased your entire portfolio of personal debt yesterday afternoon, using the very same hidden equity that used to protect my father's logistics company. Spencer gripped the sharp glass edge of my desk, his knuckles turning completely white as his knees visibly threatened to buckle beneath his weight. He looked like a man who had just been handed a death sentence. I do not want to be in the family will, Spencer, I whispered, leaning forward until we were only inches apart. I already bought your debt. I own you. Spencer could not speak. He looked at the single sheet of paper on my desk as if it were a physical weight crushing the breath out of his lungs. His tailored suit seemed to hang loosely on his suddenly diminished frame. I watched the blood drain completely from his face, leaving him pale and trembling. He turned around and walked out of my office without uttering a single word. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind him, and I knew he was rushing back to Chantel to figure out a way to spin this disaster. But there was no spinning federal fraud. I did not have to wait long for my family to make their next move. They were predictable in their desperation. By noon the next day, my phone began ringing with calls from people I had not spoken to in years. The whisper network of the Prince George's County Black Elite operates faster than light. My Aunt Eleanor called me first, her voice dripping with that fake Southern concern my mother had perfected. She wanted to check on my mental health. According to the narrative my mother and sister were currently peddling at every country club luncheon and high society brunch, I had suffered a complete psychological breakdown. They were telling everyone who would listen that I was a jealous, unstable college dropout who was actively trying to extort my own flesh and blood out of pure spite. They claimed I had hacked into the family business accounts and manufactured fake debts because I could not handle Chantel's successful marriage and pregnancy. It was a brilliant smear campaign. Brenda and Chantel knew exactly how to play to the gallery. They painted themselves as the heartbroken victims of a deranged family member. They were using the exact same tactics they used when I was 16, and my mother told the entire neighborhood that I was caught stealing from her purse just to cover up the fact that Chantel had crashed her car and needed money for the repairs. My mother always sacrificed my reputation to preserve her golden child's flawless image. But this time, I was not a defenseless teenager hiding in my room. I was a predator who already had my teeth in their necks. I knew they were hosting the annual logistics charity gala that evening at the Oakwood Country Club. It was their most important social event of the year, a place to see and be seen, a place to solicit donations and flaunt their supposed wealth. My mother had explicitly forbidden me from attending, but I had absolutely no intention of missing the show. I spent the afternoon preparing. I did not wear an off-the-rack dress. I chose a custom-tailored emerald green gown that commanded attention in any room, and I paired it with a single diamond necklace that cost more than Spencer's fake luxury car. When I arrived at the country club, the valet opened my door, and the evening air felt crisp and electric. The ballroom was an ocean of silk suits, crystal chandeliers, and expensive champagne. The moment I stepped through the double mahogany doors, the ambient chatter in the room noticeably dipped. Heads turned. People whispered behind their cocktail glasses. My mother's smear campaign had clearly reached every single person in attendance. They were all waiting to see the unstable extortionist cause a scene. I simply smiled at the hostess and glided into the main ballroom, carrying myself with the kind of untouchable confidence that only comes from absolute financial superiority. It took less than 2 minutes for Chantel to spot me. She was wearing a massive diamond tiara and a maternity dress that practically screamed for attention. She marched across the room, her face flushed with anger, leaving a group of politicians' wives mid-sentence. She grabbed my arm and tried to pull me toward the hallway, but I planted my feet firmly into the carpet, refusing to be moved. "What are you doing here?" Chantel hissed, keeping her voice low but frantic. "Mom explicitly told you that you were no longer welcome at our events. You are socially unfit to be in this room, Desiree. You need to leave right now before I have security physically drag you out of here." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm, and she quickly pulled it away as if she had touched something hot. "I am here to support the family business, Chantel," I replied, my voice smooth and perfectly audible to the people pretending not to listen nearby. Since Spencer is currently busy dealing with his very sudden and very severe personal debt crisis, I thought someone from the family should make an appearance who actually understands how to balance a ledger. Chantel glared at me, her eyes narrowing with pure hatred. "You think you are so clever with your little threats?" she sneered. "Spencer told us everything. He told us how you fabricated those documents to try and scare him. You are a pathetic, jealous liar, and no one in this room believes a single word you say. Dad is calling the lawyers tomorrow to have you legally barred from coming within 100 feet of the company. Now get out before I make a scene." I simply smiled and picked up a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter. "You should really focus on the auction, Chantel," I said, gesturing toward the front of the room where the auctioneer was stepping up to the microphone. "You are the host, after all. It would be a shame if you missed the highlight of the evening." The silent auction was always the centerpiece of my parents' galas. It was a highly choreographed display of wealth where the local elite would bid on luxury items to prove their status. My father, Winston, stood at the front of the room, looking incredibly smug as he welcomed the guests. He had clearly convinced himself that Spencer's lies were true and that my threats were empty. He was back in his element, playing the wealthy patriarch. My mother, Brenda, stood beside him, smiling beautifully for the cameras. The auctioneer began listing the items. There were signed sports memorabilia, vintage wines, and weekend getaways. People bid politely, nodding to one another across the room. Then came the final item of the night. It was the grand prize that my parents had been promoting for weeks. A fully staffed 2-week luxury yacht vacation cruising the Amalfi Coast. The starting bid was $50,000. Winston took the microphone for a moment, looking out at the crowd. "This is a very special item, folks," he announced, his voice booming through the speakers. "An opportunity to experience true luxury while supporting a wonderful cause. Do I hear 60,000? The mayor of the county raised his paddle. 60,000. A prominent local real estate developer raised his. 75,000. The bidding went back and forth, climbing steadily as my parents watched with greedy, satisfied smiles. They loved seeing people fight over items they provided. It made them feel powerful. The bid reached $120,000, and the room grew quiet. The auctioneer looked around, searching for any final takers. "Going once for 120,000, he called out. "Going twice." I set my glass down on a nearby table. I walked straight down the center aisle, moving with deliberate, unhurried grace. The crowd parted for me naturally, their eyes wide with curiosity. My mother saw me approaching, and her perfect smile instantly shattered. She stepped forward as if to block my path, but I smoothly walked right past her and stepped up onto the small stage. Before Winston or the auctioneer could stop me, I reached out and took the microphone directly from the auctioneer's hand. The entire ballroom fell completely silent. You could hear a pin drop. I looked out over the crowd, making eye contact with the very people who had been whispering about my supposed mental breakdown just minutes prior. $150,000, I announced, my voice ringing clear and steady through the massive room. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Winston turned to me, his face twisting with rage. "What are you doing, Desiree?" he muttered under his breath. Stepping close to me, "You do not have that kind of money. Put the microphone down right now before I call the police." I ignored him completely. I reached into my small evening clutch and pulled out a certified cashier's check already made out to the charity organization for exactly $150,000. I handed it to the stunned auctioneer, who stared at the amount in absolute shock. "The bid is paid in full," I said into the microphone, looking out at the sea of astonished faces. "But I have absolutely no intention of taking this vacation. My family has always taught me the importance of recognizing the people who do the actual hard work behind the scenes. The people who carry the heavy burdens, while others take the credit." I turned and pointed toward the back of the ballroom where the catering staff was standing near the kitchen doors. They were a group of hardworking, tired people who had been serving food and pouring drinks all night while my parents treated them like invisible servants. "I am donating this fully paid yacht vacation to the catering staff working this event tonight," I announced. "They can divide the timeshare, the asset, or sell it and split the cash. They have earned a taste of the luxury they spend their lives serving to others." For 5 long seconds, nobody moved. The catering staff at the back of the room looked at each other in sheer disbelief. Then one of the older waiters began to clap. It started slow, but within moments a huge portion of the ballroom joined in. People love a dramatic display of philanthropy, and they love a spectacle even more. The applause was deafening. I had not just caused a scene, I had completely hijacked their event, asserted my absolute financial dominance, and humiliated them by giving their grand prize to the hired help. I handed the microphone back to the auctioneer and walked off the stage. Winston was completely frozen, his mouth hanging slightly open as he stared at the crowd applauding me. His narrative about the broke, unstable daughter had just been publicly obliterated by a certified check that proved I was wealthier than most of the people in the room. I walked out of the ballroom and headed down the quiet, carpeted hallway toward the restrooms. I knew exactly what was coming next. I pushed open the door to the luxurious ladies' room and walked over to the marble sinks, turning on the cold water to wash my hands. Less than 30 seconds later, the heavy door swung open and slammed shut. My mother, Brenda, stood there shaking with a rage so intense she could barely form words. Her expensive gown rustled as she marched up to me, grabbing my shoulder and spinning me around to face her. "What is wrong with you?" she demanded, her voice a venomous hiss echoing off the tile walls. "Where did you get that kind of money, Desiree? Whose money is that? Did you steal from your father's company to stage this ridiculous stunt tonight? You are trying to destroy everything we built, just because you are a miserable, jealous child." I calmly reached up and removed her hand from my shoulder, letting my arm drop to my side. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like a worthless burden. She looked terrified. The facade was cracking and the ugly, desperate truth was pouring out. "I did not steal a single dime from Winston's company, Mom," I said, speaking slowly so she would absorb every single word. "Spencer is the one who stole your money. Spencer is the one who drained the operational accounts to pay for his mistresses and his gambling debts. I am the one who built a private equity firm from the ground up while you were busy paying for Chantel's country club memberships." She shook her head in furious denial. "You are lying. Spencer is a financial genius. He manages our entire personal stock portfolio. He told us the market was volatile, but our investments are completely secure. You are just trying to turn us against him." I pulled a small folded piece of paper from my clutch and held it out to her. She stared at it for a moment before snatching it from my hand. Her eyes scanned the document, and I watched the exact moment her entire world stopped spinning. I make my money by finding weak, corrupt investments and betting against them. I explained, my tone completely devoid of sympathy. I make my money by shorting the market. When I saw the ridiculous shell companies and the terrible tech stocks that Spencer was recommending, you and Winston invest your personal retirement funds into, I knew exactly what he was doing. He was artificially inflating worthless assets to cover his own tracks. My mother looked up from the paper, her breathing ragged. "What does this mean?" she whispered, the anger finally giving way to genuine horror. "It means I bet heavily against the exact same companies Spencer told you to put your life savings into," I said, smiling coldly. "I made millions of dollars watching those specific stocks crash and burn this afternoon. I bought that yacht vacation tonight with the profits I made from your financial ruin. By shorting the very stocks Spencer told you to invest in, I took everything. Your portfolio is empty." "Mom." My mother stood frozen, staring at the folded piece of paper in her trembling hands. The harsh fluorescent lighting of the country club restroom highlighted every new line of terror on her face. She tried to speak, but only a weak, hollow sound escaped her throat. The realization that her precious son-in-law had completely bankrupted them was finally sinking in. She had spent her entire adult life worshipping at the altar of wealth and status, and now the altar was empty. I did not wait for her to formulate an excuse or a defense. I simply turned around and walked out of the restroom, leaving her alone with the devastating truth. I walked past the remaining guests, out the heavy glass doors, and into the cool night air. My driver was waiting. I slid into the back seat of the black car, feeling an incredible sense of clarity. The first domino had fallen, but the chain reaction was far from over. It took exactly 3 weeks for the financial rot to fully set into the foundation of my parents' fake empire. Winston's logistics company was officially bleeding out. Spencer had been quietly terminated, but Winston was too proud and too terrified of social humiliation to press criminal charges or publicly admit that his white savior son-in-law had robbed him blind. Instead, they tried to keep up appearances. They lived in a profound state of denial, hoping for a miracle that was never going to come. And nothing showcased that sickening denial better than Chantel's baby shower. Despite the fact that their bank accounts were frozen and their credit lines were completely severed, Chantel insisted on hosting an outrageously lavish celebration at the family mansion in Prince George's County. She had undoubtedly bullied my mother into using the last of their hidden emergency cash to fund the spectacle. I received the details from a former family friend who was disgusted by their behavior. There were massive archways made of imported white roses and pastel pink orchids framing the driveway. A towering champagne fountain stood in the grand foyer, and a live string quartet played soft classical music on the outdoor patio. Dozens of wealthy women from the neighborhood paraded around in designer sundresses, eating caviar and ignoring the very obvious tension radiating from my parents. They were celebrating a baby that was going to be born into absolute financial ruin. I did not receive an invitation to the baby shower, but I had a very specific delivery to make. I pulled up to the wrought iron gates of the estate, just as the caterers were bringing out the extravagant 4-tier fondant cake. The security guard at the gate recognized me and buzzed me through without a word. I did not park in the guest area. I had my driver pull the car directly up to the grand entrance, blocking the driveway. I stepped out of the vehicle wearing a sharp charcoal gray business suit that meant business. I was not alone. Walking right beside me was a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a simple navy suit, holding a thick manila envelope. He was a professional process server, and he was here to do exactly what I paid him to do. We walked through the open front doors and stepped into the massive grand foyer. The sound of the string quartet drifted in from the patio, mingling with the loud, obnoxious laughter of my sister. I walked straight through the living room, my heels clicking loudly against the polished mahogany floors that I had once been forced to scrub. Guests began to notice my presence, and the lively chatter slowly started to die down. Women in expensive pastel dresses turned to stare, whispering behind their manicured hands. They remembered the country club gala. They remembered the yacht vacation. They knew exactly who I was, and they knew I was not here to drop off a baby gift. I found Chantel standing near the patio doors, surrounded by a mountain of beautifully wrapped presents. My mother Brenda was standing rigidly next to her, holding a glass of sparkling cider with a white knuckle grip. My father Winston was hovering near the bar, trying to look completely unbothered. When Chantel saw me, her face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. The fake, sweet smile she had been wearing for her friends completely vanished. She slammed her glass down on a nearby table so hard the crystal nearly shattered. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" Desiree Chantel shouted, her voice shrill and echoing across the sudden silence of the room. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. Every single eye in the mansion was locked on us. "I told you that you were socially unfit to be around normal people. You crashed the gala and embarrassed us, and now you are crashing my baby shower. Security, get this jealous, unstable dropout out of my house immediately." Winston stepped forward, his chest puffed out, trying to play the role of the protective, strong patriarch. He pointed a thick finger at me. "You have exactly 5 seconds to turn around and walk out that door, Desiree." He warned, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "You have caused enough damage to this family with your lies and your manipulation. You owe us everything. We gave you a life. We gave you a home. We paid for your entire existence, and you repay us with nothing but spite and sabotage." I stopped walking and stood perfectly still. The sheer audacity of his words ignited a cold, calculating fury deep inside my chest. I looked at my father, and then I looked at my mother, who was actively avoiding my gaze. "You paid for my existence," I repeated, my voice dropping to a low, steady volume that carried clearly across the dead, silent room. "You did not pay for anything, Winston. You stole it." I turned my attention to the wealthy guests who were watching the drama unfold with wide, fascinated eyes. "My family loves to tell everyone that I am a college dropout," I said smoothly, ensuring every word landed with devastating precision. "They love to tell the country club elite that I just could not handle the pressure of higher education and that I was a disappointment who walked away from a prestigious university. But they always conveniently forget to mention the actual reason I had to leave school." I looked directly into Chantel's furious eyes. "They forget to mention that 10 years ago, when I was a junior with a 4.0 grade point average, my tuition check bounced. It bounced because my loving parents secretly completely drained my entire college savings account, an account that my grandmother had set up for me. They emptied every single penny of my future so they could pay for Chantel's $200,000 dream wedding to Spencer. They stole my education to pay for ice sculptures and imported caviar for a man who would eventually bankrupt them. I had to drop out of school because you thieves took my money to fund your superficial aesthetic. I built my private equity firm from absolute scratch, working 90-hour weeks while you popped champagne and pretended to be royalty. You do not owe me an apology, Winston. You owe me my entire future." The guests gasped audibly. Several women covered their mouths in shock. My mother closed her eyes and turned her head away, unable to face the public exposure of her most shameful secret. Chantel's mouth hung open, her face draining of color as her friends turned to look at her with sudden, undisguised disgust. The illusion of their perfect, wealthy family was completely shattered, exposing the rotting, thieving foundation beneath it. Winston tried to recover his composure, but he was visibly shaking. "That is a lie," he stammered, taking a step backward. "You are making up ridiculous stories because you are bitter. Get out of my house right now." "It is not your house, Winston," I said softly. I turned to the man standing quietly beside me and gave him a brief nod. The process server stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and my father. He held out the thick manila envelope. "Winston Hayes?" the man asked in a firm, professional tone. Winston stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. He slowly nodded, unable to speak. The process server pressed the envelope directly against Winston's chest, forcing him to take it. "You have been served," the man said, before stepping back and folding his hands in front of him. Winston looked down at the heavy envelope. His hands trembled as he tore open the flap and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. His eyes scanned the first page, and I watched his entire body physically deflate. The color left his face, leaving him looking old gray and completely broken. Brenda rushed to his side, looking over his shoulder at the papers. "What is it?" she asked, her voice filled with panic. "Winston, what does it say?" He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it almost looked like madness. "You cannot do this," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You cannot kick us out of our own home." Chantel let out a dramatic shriek, clutching her pregnant belly. "You are trying to make us homeless," she cried, tears finally spilling down her perfectly made-up cheeks. "You are a monster, Desiree. This is our family estate." I took a slow, deliberate step toward them, my posture perfectly straight, and my expression completely unreadable. I had waited 10 years for this exact moment. I had spent a decade building my wealth, mastering the financial markets, and waiting for their fragile empire of lies to inevitably crumble. I pointed a manicured finger at the legal paperwork trembling in my father's hands. "I did not just buy Spencer's personal debt," I explained, my voice echoing through the silent mansion. "When your logistics company defaulted on the $8 million loan last week, it triggered a massive chain reaction across all of your financial holdings. The bank immediately called in the mortgage on this estate because you used this house as collateral to keep the business afloat. You defaulted on the mortgage, Winston. The property went into immediate distressed foreclosure." My mother let out a small wounded sob, covering her face with her hands. "My private equity firm specializes in acquiring highly distressed luxury assets." I continued, watching the total devastation wash over their faces. "I purchased the deed to this entire estate directly from the bank yesterday morning, paid in full with the money I made from shorting your worthless stock portfolio." Winston stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "You cannot kick us out," he repeated weakly, unable to grasp the magnitude of his defeat. I smiled coldly, looking around at the massive rose archways and the towering champagne fountain. "I am not kicking you out of your home, Winston," I said softly. "I am evicting you from my property. It has not been your home for 48 hours. You have exactly 30 days to vacate the premises. Please make sure you take the ice sculptures with you." I turned on my heel and walked back through the grand foyer, the guests parting like the Red Sea to let me pass. I walked out the front doors and into the bright afternoon sunlight, leaving the ruins of my toxic family behind me forever. The days following the baby shower eviction notice were quiet and incredibly peaceful. I returned to my penthouse condo and threw myself back into my work at the private equity firm, managing portfolios and structuring hostile takeovers with a clear head. I knew the fallout was happening somewhere across the state, but I was completely insulated from their panic in my downtown sanctuary. My lawyers were handling the 30-day notice and ensuring that Winston and Brenda could not strip the mansion of its expensive fixtures before they vacated the premises. I assumed they were running out of options and hiding from their social circle, while the reality of their bankruptcy finally settled over them. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the silence was finally broken. I had decided to treat myself to a late lunch at a highly exclusive seafood restaurant down by the waterfront. The dining room was elegant and hushed, filled with soft jazz music, and wealthy patrons conducting quiet business over plates of fresh oysters and expensive white wine. I was sitting at my favorite corner table, looking out at the boats passing by on the river, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment. I had finally cut the toxic dead weight from my life, and I was breathing clean air for the first time. That clean air was violently sucked out of the room when the heavy glass doors of the restaurant flew open. I did not have to look up to know who it was. I could hear the aggressive heavy clicking of her designer heels marching across the polished hardwood floor. Chantel ignored the maitre d', who tried to ask if she had a reservation, pushing past him with her massive leather handbag swinging at her side. She was wearing a tight, pale pink maternity dress that prominently displayed her pregnant belly and a pair of oversized dark sunglasses that covered half her face. She scanned the room frantically until she spotted me sitting in the corner. Her mouth twisted into an ugly sneer, and she stomped directly toward my table, drawing the annoyed stares of several nearby diners. Chantel did not ask to sit down. She grabbed the heavy wooden chair opposite me and pulled it back so hard it scraped loudly against the floor. She threw her expensive handbag onto the pristine white tablecloth, knocking over a small vase of flowers. She leaned forward, resting her arms on the table, and glared at me from behind her dark lenses. "You need to fix this right now. Desiree?" She demanded, her voice a harsh, trembling whisper that vibrated with absolute rage. "You are completely ruining my pregnancy. My blood pressure is through the roof and my doctor says the stress is going to hurt the baby. You are being incredibly selfish and I am not going to let you destroy my life over some petty, childish sibling rivalry." I calmly picked up my linen napkin and wiped a drop of spilled water from the table. "I did not invite you to sit with me, Chantel," I said, my voice perfectly level and quiet. "And I am certainly not responsible for your blood pressure or your stress levels. You should probably take up your medical concerns with your husband since he is the one who actively bankrupted your parents and forced your family into complete financial ruin." Chantel let out a sharp, bitter laugh that caused the couple at the next table to look over in distaste. "Spencer is a genius," she spat out, leaning closer until I could smell the strong, sweet perfume she was wearing. "He made a few aggressive investments that did not pan out because the global market suddenly shifted. That is exactly what happens in high-level corporate finance. You would not understand because you just sit behind a desk and crunch numbers for other people all day long. Dad told me everything. He told me you bought the mortgage out from under them just to be vindictive and cruel. You need to transfer the deed back into Dad's name today, and you need to wire Spencer the money to cover the margin call immediately. If you do that right now, we might be willing to forgive you and let you back into the family before my baby is born." I looked at her, marveling at the sheer, terrifying depth of her delusion. She was sitting there facing total, absolute financial annihilation, and she was still trying to treat me like a subordinate who was desperate for her permission to exist in the world. She honestly believed that the promise of being allowed back into their toxic inner circle was enough to make me hand over millions of dollars. I reached down into my leather work tote and pulled out a slim black folder. I placed it gently on the table and slid it across the white linen until it rested right in front of her folded hands. "You really think Spencer just made a few bad trades in the stock market?" I asked softly, keeping my eyes locked on her face. "You truly think the millions of dollars that vanished from the company operational accounts just evaporated into thin air because of a market shift? Open the folder, Chantel. Look at the absolute genius of your husband." Chantel hesitated, her perfectly manicured fingers hovering over the black edge of the folder. She looked at me with a flicker of genuine apprehension before slowly flipping the cover open. The first few pages were highly detailed bank statements that I had legally acquired during the hostile debt takeover. I watched her eyes scan the numbers, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. "What is this garbage?" she asked defensively, trying to sound dismissive. "Those are the verified routing numbers for a private offshore shell account in the Cayman Islands." I explained, my voice devoid of any emotion or sympathy. "And those specific digital transfers right there? The ones I highlighted in yellow represent the exact moments over the last 2 years when Spencer systematically drained your personal trust fund, the massive fund that Mom and Dad set up for you when you got married. He did not just steal from the logistics company, Chantel. He stole every single dollar that belonged to you. Your entire personal safety net is completely gone." Chantel stared at this paper, her breathing suddenly becoming very shallow and rapid. "That is impossible," she whispered, shaking her head in denial. "He told me that money was tied up in long-term secure municipal bonds. He explicitly told me we could not touch it until the baby turned 18. You fabricated these documents to try and scare me." "Turn the page," I commanded quietly, refusing to let her look away from the reality of her situation. She turned to the next section of the folder. There were crisp, high-resolution photographs taken by a private investigator just 3 weeks prior. They showed Spencer standing on the expansive balcony of a luxury penthouse condominium in Miami. He was shirtless, laughing and holding a glass of expensive champagne. Wrapped tightly around his waist was Jessica, the young blonde junior analyst from his old corporate brokerage firm. The subsequent glossy photos showed them walking on the beach holding hands and shopping at high-end designer boutiques in South Beach. That penthouse cost $20,000 a month to rent, I told her, watching as she stared down at the images of her husband kissing another woman. He bought her that massive diamond tennis bracelet on the exact weekend of your third wedding anniversary. He has been taking her on lavish tropical vacations using the money he siphoned directly from your drained trust fund while you sit in a mansion in Maryland, playing the role of the perfect pregnant society wife. Your husband is not a financial genius, Chantel. He is a common pathetic thief and a serial cheater who has completely and utterly humiliated you in front of everyone. I sat back in my chair and waited for the inevitable explosion. I waited for the tears, the devastation, the absolute heartbreak of a pregnant woman realizing her entire marriage was a fraudulent, toxic lie. I expected her to scream or throw the folder across the restaurant in a fit of passionate rage. But the tears never came. The emotional breakdown never materialized. Chantel stared at the photographs for a long, tense minute. Her face was completely blank. Then she slowly closed the black folder and pushed her oversized designer sunglasses up onto the top of her head. Her eyes were dry and completely cold. There was no sorrow in her gaze, only a harsh, calculating cruelty. "You really think I did not know he was sleeping around?" she asked, her voice dropping into a flat, deadpan tone that chilled me to the bone. "Please, Desiree, do not insult my intelligence. Men like Spencer always have someone on the side to stroke their egos. I am not some naive little housewife. I do not care who he sleeps with in Miami or anywhere else as long as he comes home to me and pays for my lifestyle." I sat perfectly still, genuinely stunned by the absolute darkness of her admission. "You do not care that he stole your own money to spend on his secret mistress?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The only thing I care about right now is the fact that you are trying to take my entire life away," Chantel hissed, leaning across the table like a striking snake. "If you expose him to the authorities, the federal government will freeze everything we own. The money will be gone forever, and I will be completely ruined socially. My friends will laugh at me behind my back. The country club will whisper about me every time I walk into the dining room. I will be a single mother with a husband sitting in a federal prison and absolutely no money to maintain my image or my social standing. I completely refuse to let that happen to me." She tapped her long, pointed fingernail hard against the top of the closed black folder. "Here is what is going to happen, Desiree. You are going to give me the cash to cover exactly what he took. You are going to replace my trust fund and pay off the margin call today so the bank leaves us alone and Dad gets his company back. If you do not wire me the money right now, I will go straight to the police precinct and file a formal criminal report against you. I will tell the detectives that you are the forensic accountant. I will tell them that you are the one who hacked into the company servers, manipulated the books, and set up the offshore accounts to frame my innocent husband, because you have always been insanely jealous of me and my perfect life. Who do you think they will believe, Desiree? The bitter, estranged dropout who works with numbers all day, or the pregnant, crying sister who just wants to protect her family from a vindictive sociopath?" I looked at the woman sitting across from me, and I felt a sudden, profound, heavy emptiness settle in my chest. For 28 years, I had wondered why my sister hated me so much. I had tried endlessly to find some logical reason for her relentless cruelty and her need to destroy my accomplishments. But staring into her cold, dead eyes, I finally understood the horrifying, ugly truth. Chantel was completely hollow inside. There was no soul, no morality, no capacity for genuine human love. There was only a desperate, endless black hole of hunger for status and an absolute ruthless willingness to destroy anyone who stood in her way. She was willing to protect a man who robbed her blind and send her own innocent sister to a federal prison just to keep up appearances at the local country club. She was truly fundamentally beyond saving. I did not yell. I did not argue. I did not even feel angry anymore. I reached into my purse and pulled out a crisp $100 bill, dropping it onto the table to cover the cost of my untouched lunch. I picked up my leather tote bag and stood up, looking down at the pathetic, desperate creature wearing my sister's face. I do not care what ridiculous lies you try to tell the police. Chantel, I said, my voice as cold and hard as solid ice. Federal financial investigators do not care about your fake country club tears or your dramatic pregnancy stories. They care about digital footprints, verified IP addresses, encrypted wire transfers, and offshore banking records, all of which lead directly and undeniably to Spencer's personal laptop sitting on his desk. You can try to protect your cheating thief of a husband all you want, but the FBI received my anonymous, deeply documented tip 3 hours ago. They are probably raiding your lovely mansion and his corporate office right now as we speak. Enjoy your precious lifestyle while it lasts, Chantel. I turned around and walked away from the table, leaving her sitting completely alone with her empty folder, her broken illusions, and the absolute certainty of her impending destruction. I walked out of the restaurant and stepped into the warm, bright afternoon sun, feeling nothing but the clean, pure, weightless freedom of finally being completely done. Winston had called an emergency board meeting exactly at 2:00 in the afternoon. He thought he was making a brilliant tactical move. He brought in a team of highly paid corporate lawyers and planned to illegally dilute my original shares. He thought he could use a loophole in the corporate bylaws to force me out of the company entirely and regain control of the logistics empire. When I walked into the massive glass-walled boardroom, Winston and Spencer were sitting at the far end, looking incredibly smug. They expected an easy win against the black sheep of the family. I walked in calmly with my own lead counsel Marcus and a team of vicious corporate litigators trailing behind me. I took a seat at the opposite end of the long mahogany table and simply told them to proceed with their little vote. Winston confidently called the motion to strip me of my voting rights. He thought he had the backing of the board, but what he did not know was that over the past 6 months, I had been quietly and meticulously buying up the shares of every single disgruntled minority shareholder who was tired of his incompetence. When the vote was called, I did not even blink. I simply let Marcus slide a massive stack of certified shareholder agreements across the table. "You cannot vote me out, Winston," I said, my voice cutting through the smug atmosphere of the room. "I currently hold 55% of the voting rights. As the new majority shareholder, my first order of business is officially firing the chief executive officer and the chief financial officer." The corporate lawyers Winston brought with him immediately reviewed my documents. Their faces went completely pale. They whispered something into Winston's ear, packed up their briefcases, and literally walked out of the room without saying another word. They knew a lost cause when they saw one. The silence that followed the exit of the corporate lawyers was heavy and absolute. It was the kind of thick, suffocating silence that only occurs when a massive structure finally collapses into dust, leaving nothing but ruin in its wake. Winston remained frozen in his chair, his eyes fixed blindly on the polished mahogany table. The deep purple flush of his rage had faded into a sickly pale gray. He looked like a hollowed-out shell of the arrogant patriarch who had tried to intimidate me just moments before. Spencer was still weeping quietly into his hands, a pathetic broken sound that echoed in the vast emptiness of the boardroom. I did not feel an ounce of pity for either of them. I sat comfortably at the head of the table, my posture relaxed but completely commanding. I had spent my entire life being pushed to the margins, told to shrink myself so their fragile egos could expand. I had swallowed their insults, endured their mockery, and quietly paid their debts while they paraded around, pretending to be titans of industry. And now, in a matter of minutes, I had systematically dismantled every single illusion they had ever built. My lead counsel Marcus stepped forward and placed a small stack of sleek black cardboard boxes onto the center of the conference table. The sharp cardboard scraping against the wood made both Winston and Spencer flinch. "Your 10-minute start right now, gentlemen," Marcus said, his voice smooth and incredibly professional. "I strongly suggest you gather any personal effects you wish to keep. Any corporate documents, digital devices, or company property must remain in this room. Failure to comply will result in immediate charges of corporate theft, which I assure you will not help your impending federal indictments." Spencer was the first to move. He slowly lifted his head, his face blotchy and stained with tears. He looked at me with a desperate, pleading expression that made my stomach turn. "Desiree, please." He choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "I have a family. Chantel is pregnant. If you just let me stay and help transition the accounts, maybe I can show the FBI that I was cooperating. Maybe I can get a reduced sentence. You cannot just throw me out like trash." I rested my chin on my hand, studying his tear-streaked face with cold detachment. "You threw yourself out the moment you decided to steal millions of dollars from this company to fund your secret penthouse in Miami, Spencer," I replied, my tone completely flat. "You leveraged your pregnant wife and her family to cover your gambling debts and your massive infidelity. You do not get to use Chantel's pregnancy as a shield now that you have been caught. Pack your box." Spencer let out another pathetic sob and shakily pushed his chair back. He stumbled over to the corner of the room where he had left his expensive leather briefcase and began pulling out a few framed photos and a ridiculously expensive fountain pen. He moved like a man walking to his own execution, completely broken and entirely pathetic. Winston slowly raised his head. The sheer shock was finally wearing off, and the toxic, malignant pride that had fueled his entire life began to violently resurface. He slammed his fist down onto the table, causing the black cardboard boxes to rattle. "You ungrateful, vicious little snake!" he snarled, his voice vibrating with a dark, hateful energy. "You think you have won. You think because you bought some shares behind my back that you are suddenly a genius. I built this company from nothing, Desiree. I shed blood, sweat, and tears to create this legacy, and you waltz in here with your fancy lawyers and steal it from me. You are nothing but a common thief, just like the rest of the bottom feeders in this world." I did not raise my voice. I did not react to his anger. I simply looked at him with an expression of profound pity. "You did not build a legacy, Winston," I said softly, my words cutting through his rage like a scalpel. "You built a house of cards on a foundation of massive debt and extreme incompetence. You were so obsessed with the aesthetic of being a wealthy black patriarch that you completely ignored the actual mechanics of running a sustainable business. You let a mediocre white man steal you blind because he wore a nice suit and knew how to order expensive bourbon. You drained my college fund to pay for a wedding that was nothing more than a shallow photo op. You leveraged your own home to pay off loans you never should have taken. You are not a victim, Winston. You are the architect of your own destruction." He stared at me, his chest heaving as the truth of my words hit him. He wanted to scream at me. He wanted to deny it. But the mountain of legal documents sitting between us proved that every single thing I said was an undeniable fact. "I am taking my company back, and I am going to liquidate the remaining viable assets to pay back the people you screwed over." I continued, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "Uncle Terrence and the other minority shareholders will finally get the returns they were promised a decade ago. The catering staff you treated like garbage got the vacation they deserved. And you, Winston, get exactly what you earned. Absolutely nothing." Winston stood up slowly, his movements stiff and uncoordinated. He did not bother grabbing a box. He did not have any personal items in this room that truly mattered to him anymore. The illusion was gone, and he could not bear to look at the ruins. He straightened his wrinkled suit jacket one last time, a desperate reflex to maintain some shred of dignity. "You are dead to me, Desiree," he whispered, his voice trembling with a final futile attempt at control. "You are no daughter of mine. You will die alone and miserable with your money because nobody in this family will ever speak to you again." I smiled, a small, genuine smile of pure relief. "I certainly hope so, Winston," I replied, my voice calm and completely free. "That is exactly what I have been waiting for." He turned and walked out of the boardroom, his footsteps heavy and dragging on the plush carpet. Spencer followed closely behind him, clutching his cardboard box to his chest like a shield. His head bowed in absolute defeat. The heavy mahogany doors closed behind them, sealing them out of my life and out of my company forever. I sat alone at the head of the long table, listening to the quiet hum of the building around me. The storm outside was still raging, the rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows, but inside the boardroom, the air felt incredibly clear. Marcus stepped up beside me and placed a fresh stack of transition documents in front of me along with a sleek silver pen. "Where would you like to begin, Mrs. Hayes?" he asked, his tone respectful and ready for action. I picked up the pen and looked out over the sprawling city skyline, taking a deep, full breath of the clean air. "Let us start by calling the federal authorities," I said smoothly, uncapping the pen. "I believe they have a very keen interest in Mr. Spencer's offshore accounts. And then, Marcus, we are going to burn this entire toxic structure to the ground and build something real." It had been exactly 72 hours since I took control of the boardroom and fired my father. The corporate transition was swift and brutal. Marcus and my legal team had frozen all executive accounts, changed the locks on every building, and handed decades of fraudulent financial records over to the federal investigators. My penthouse was quiet, and I was finally settling into the reality that the war was over. But desperate people never surrender quietly. They always have one final performance left in them. My phone buzzed on the kitchen island. It was an unknown number, but the caller ID registered as Mercy General Hospital. I answered to the frantic voice of a triage nurse who informed me that my mother Brenda had been admitted through the emergency room. According to the nurse, she had suffered a severe panic attack that mimicked a cardiac event. The nurse said my mother was hyperventilating, clutching her chest and begging for me by name. She told the hospital staff that her heart was failing because of a terrible family tragedy and that she needed to see her youngest daughter before it was too late. I knew exactly what this was. My mother was a master manipulator who treated reality like a stage play. Whenever she was backed into a corner and stripped of her power, she resorted to playing the ultimate victim. She could not bully me or shame me anymore, so she decided to weaponize her own mortality. I told the nurse I would be there shortly. I did not rush. I finished my coffee, changed into a sharp black suit, and had my driver take me to the hospital. When I walked into the private hospital room, the air smelled of rubbing alcohol and sterile sheets. Brenda was lying in the center of the bed, looking incredibly small and deliberately pathetic. She wore a faded hospital gown and had a heart monitor clipped to her finger. She had clearly wiped away all of her makeup and messed up her normally perfect hair to make herself look as fragile and sick as possible. The rhythmic beeping of the machines provided a dramatic soundtrack to her performance. Winston and Chantel were conveniently missing, leaving the stage entirely to her. As soon as the heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me, my mother turned her head. She let out a weak, trembling gasp, and tears immediately flooded her eyes. "Desiree," she whispered, her voice shaking and reedy, as if she could barely draw breath. "You came. I knew you would come." I stood at the foot of her hospital bed, resting my hands lightly on the plastic railing. I did not step closer. I did not offer her a comforting smile or reach out to hold her trembling hand. I simply watched her perform. She began to sob, clutching the thin hospital blanket to her chest. "Desiree, please, you have to stop this," she cried, her tears spilling down her pale cheeks. "The stress of losing the house and your father losing his company is literally killing me. My heart cannot take this kind of pressure. My chest is in absolute agony, and the doctors say my blood pressure is at a critical level. You have proven your point, Desiree. You showed us how smart and powerful you are, but this has gone too far." She paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath to emphasize her supposed physical distress. "Chantel is completely inconsolable," she sobbed. "Spencer is facing federal charges, and she cries every single night because her baby is going to be born into a nightmare. We are your family, Desiree. Blood is supposed to mean something. Family is supposed to forgive and protect each other. You have to sign the company back over to your father. You have to stop the eviction and wire us the money to save the estate. If you do not fix this right now, the stress is going to cause a fatal heart attack right here in this bed, and you will have to live with the guilt of killing your own mother. She squeezed her eyes shut and let out a dramatic whimper, waiting for me to break. She was waiting for the frightened little girl inside me to panic and surrender to her emotional blackmail. She honestly believed that wrapping her greed in a hospital gown would be enough to make me hand over millions of dollars and walk away from my own justice. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like a worthless burden. I looked at the mother who had watched my sister push me down the stairs of life and laughed while I bled. I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional manipulation bounced off me like rain on concrete. "You are putting on a wonderful show, Mom," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any sympathy. "Your heart rate on the monitor has been perfectly steady since I walked into this room. Your blood oxygen is completely normal. You are not dying. You are just broke." Brenda's eyes snapped open, the tears instantly pausing as she registered the coldness in my tone. "Desiree, how can you be so cruel?" she gasped, clutching her chest again. "I am hooked up to machines." I opened my leather tote bag and reached inside. I did not pull out the corporate transfer papers she was desperately hoping for. I did not pull out a checkbook to save her precious mansion. Instead, I pulled out a thick stapled folder containing a certified credit report and financial history. I walked over to the side of the bed and dropped the heavy folder directly onto her lap. I spent years wondering why my tuition check bounced when I was a junior in college. I said, speaking with a slow, methodical precision. I always wondered why every single bank denied my applications for a student loan when I tried to finish my degree. You and Winston told me that it was my own fault. You told me that I just did not have the financial responsibility to secure a loan and that I was destined to be a dropout. I thought it was a system error or just bad luck. Brenda stared at the black folder on her lap, but she did not touch it. Her breathing hitched, but it was no longer a fake theatrical gasp. It was the sharp intake of real, genuine fear. But it was not a mistake at all. I continued stepping closer to the bed so she could not avoid my gaze. "When my financial team was doing a deep dive into your personal accounts this week to verify the bankruptcy, they uncovered a very interesting hidden paper trail." "Open the folder, Mom." She refused to move, her hands remaining gripped tightly around the hospital blanket. "I will tell you what it says then," I whispered, my voice dropping to a dangerous hush. "It says that when I was 18 years old, you stole my social security number. It shows that you forged my signature to open 6 different high-limit luxury credit cards in my name. And then you maxed every single one of them out to the absolute limit. You ruined my credit before I was even 20 years old. You stole my identity and destroyed my financial future before it even started." Brenda swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward the door as if looking for an escape. "I do not know what you are talking about," she stammered, her victim routine beginning to fracture. "The credit card statements matched perfectly with your purchases," I said, slicing through her pathetic denial. "You used my stolen identity to buy Chantel designer clothes for her sorority events. You used my social security number to fund her luxury vacations to Europe and to buy her first brand new car. You sabotaged my entire future. You forced me to drop out of college, and you saddled me with crippling debt, just so your golden child could maintain her lavish lifestyle without you having to dip into your own bank accounts. You are not just a terrible mother, Brenda. You are a criminal." The fragile, sick old woman act vanished in an absolute instant. The tears completely dried up, and a dark, angry flush rushed back into her pale face. Brenda ripped the oxygen monitor off her finger and sat straight up in the hospital bed, the illusion of her failing health entirely forgotten. Her eyes burned with a vicious, unapologetic defiance. "I did what I had to do for Chantel," she yelled, her voice suddenly strong, loud, and dripping with venom. "You were always fine on your own, Desiree. You were smart and resourceful, and you always figured things out, but your sister needed those things to fit in with the right crowd. She needed that lifestyle to attract a wealthy husband and secure her future. I am her mother, and I made sure she had exactly what she needed to survive in our social circle. You were strong enough to take the hit. You should be thanking me because dropping out of school clearly pushed you to become a billionaire. I stared at her, marveling at the twisted, toxic logic that governed her entire existence. She had stolen my identity, ruined my life, and justified it all by claiming I was simply strong enough to survive her abuse. She felt absolutely no remorse for sacrificing her youngest daughter at the altar of her oldest daughter's vanity. "You are right, Mom," I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady against her raging anger. "I was strong enough to survive it. I built an empire while you and your favorite daughter built a house of lies funded by stolen money. And now the bill has finally come due." I reached out and tapped the cover of the folder sitting on her lap. "You can keep that copy," I told her, taking a step back toward the hospital room door. "I just wanted you to know exactly why I will never sign that company back over to Winston and why you will be out on the street by the end of the month." Brenda glared at me, her chest heaving as she realized that her emotional blackmail had completely failed. "You are a cold, heartless monster, Desiree," she spat out, gripping the folder tightly. "We are your family and you are destroying us over money." I smiled, a slow, cold smile that finally made the confidence drain out of her eyes. "I am not destroying you over money, Mom," I replied, opening the heavy wooden door to leave. "I am destroying you because you are a thief, and you will be absolutely fine on your own too. You are very resourceful when you are desperate. You will have to be." I just handed that entire credit fraud file over to the IRS and the federal authorities. "Enjoy your recovery." I walked out of the hospital, sliding doors, and let the cool evening air wash over me. Leaving my mother in that sterile room clutching the fraudulent credit report was the closing of a deeply painful chapter. She had tried to use her fake fragile health to manipulate me into surrendering, but her tears held absolutely no power over me anymore. I climbed into the back of my waiting car and told my driver to take me back to my office. My mother was currently dealing with the crushing reality of federal tax fraud, but there was still one more rat scrambling around in the dark trying to find a way off the sinking ship. Spencer was completely losing his mind. He had been banished from the company boardroom, stripped of his titles, and utterly humiliated in front of the entire executive team. But men like Spencer, men who coast through life on a mixture of unearned arrogance and borrowed wealth, never know when to simply surrender. They always think they are the smartest person in the room. He knew the walls were rapidly closing in on him. He knew that my legal team was currently tearing through 10 years of his fraudulent bookkeeping. He knew that the IRS was building a massive case against my parents, and it would only be a matter of hours before those federal agents turned their magnifying glasses directly onto his personal offshore accounts. While I was standing in that hospital room exposing my mother's identity theft, Spencer was locked inside his home office at the mansion, the very same mansion that was currently under my legal ownership. He was frantically typing on his personal laptop, his hands slick with cold sweat. He thought he had a secret backdoor access code to the company reserve accounts. He believed that because he was the former chief financial officer, he had buried one final account deep enough in the corporate shell structure that my forensic team would not be able to find it. There was exactly $2 million left in that hidden reserve. It was the absolute last drop of liquid cash that the logistics company possessed. Spencer wanted it. He needed it to fund his escape. He typed in the routing numbers for his private, untouchable bank account in the Cayman Islands. He filled out the digital wire transfer forms with shaking fingers, praying that the system would process the request before the banks closed for the weekend. He clicked the final confirmation button and stared at the screen as a small green notification popped up telling him the wire transfer was pending. He leaned back in his leather chair and let out a massive sigh of relief. He honestly believed he had won. He thought he had outsmarted the bitter estranged sister. He thought he was going to take that $2 million run away to a tropical paradise with his mistress Jessica and leave Chantel and my parents to face the federal indictments all by themselves. But Spencer was not a genius. He was just a desperate thief making incredibly predictable moves. As a forensic accountant, I made my living hunting down hidden assets and tracking digital footprints. I had anticipated his desperation the very second I sat at the head of the boardroom table and fired him. I knew he would try to make one final grab for the cash. Before I even called the emergency board meeting, I had my tech team implement a hard algorithmic freeze on every single executive routing number associated with the company. The system was specifically designed to look normal on the user end. It allowed Spencer to log in. It allowed him to input his offshore routing numbers. It even gave him a fake pending notification to keep him calm. But that $2 million never left the United States. The moment Spencer hit the transfer button, the money was automatically diverted into a secure, highly monitored holding account controlled by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My lawyers had set the trap, and Spencer walked right into it. His desperate attempt to steal the remaining company funds was the absolute worst thing he could have done. By initiating an international wire transfer of stolen corporate funds across state lines, he escalated his crime to a major federal felony. He handed the authorities the exact piece of concrete evidence they needed to issue an immediate federal arrest warrant. Ignorant to the fact that he had just signed his own arrest warrant, Spencer rushed out of his home office and found Chantel in the master bedroom. He put on the performance of a lifetime. He told her that my hostile takeover was causing too much stress for the baby. He told her that they needed to get away immediately. He spun a beautiful lie about taking an impromptu, luxurious baby moon to the Bahamas to escape the toxic family drama. He promised her private beaches, expensive spa treatments, and absolute relaxation. Chantel was incredibly shallow and deeply desperate to maintain the illusion of her perfect life. Despite the fact that I had just handed her irrefutable photographic evidence of his affair with Jessica and bank statements proving he stole her trust fund, she chose to believe him. She chose the fantasy over the ugly reality. She chose the promise of a first-class vacation over the truth, because confronting the truth meant admitting she had married a monster. She wiped her tears, packed her matching Louis Vuitton luggage, and eagerly followed him out the door. She was completely oblivious to the fact that he was actually planning to abandon her the second they landed in the islands. My lead counsel Marcus called me just as I was stepping into my penthouse condo. He told me that Spencer's passport had just been flagged in the national database. The trap was fully sprung. The federal agents were already in position. Spencer and Chantel arrived at Dulles International Airport completely unaware of the invisible net closing tightly around them. They walked through the sliding glass doors of the departure terminal, looking like the picture of wealthy suburban success. Spencer was wearing a crisp polo shirt and expensive loafers, pushing a brass luggage cart piled high with designer bags. Chantel walked closely beside him, wearing a flowing silk maternity outfit, her face shielded by massive dark sunglasses, acting as if she owned the entire airport. They bypassed the regular security lines and walked directly up to the exclusive first-class check-in counter. The terminal was busy, filled with business travelers and vacationing families. Chantel complained loudly about the lack of porters to assist them, tapping her manicured fingers impatiently against the counter. Spencer tried to shush her, his eyes darting nervously around the terminal. The adrenaline of his impending escape was making him jittery and erratic. A polite ticketing agent smiled at them and asked for their passports. Spencer handed them over, his palms sweating. He watched the agent scan the small blue booklets, waiting for the beautiful sound of boarding passes being printed. Instead, the agent's computer screen flashed red. The agent paused, her professional smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. She typed something on her keyboard and then looked up at Spencer. She calmly informed them that there was a slight irregularity with their booking and asked them to wait just one moment while she called a supervisor to override the system error. Spencer felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He reached for the passports, demanding them back, claiming they would just book a different flight. But it was far too late. From the edges of the crowded terminal, Two tall men wearing plain dark suits and earpieces stepped out from behind the security pillars. They moved with a quiet, terrifying purpose, cutting through the crowd of travelers directly toward the first-class counter. They did not rush, but their pace was entirely unavoidable. Spencer saw them approaching, and his entire body froze. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He took a step backward, his survival instincts screaming at him to run, but his legs refused to move. There was nowhere to go. The walls had finally closed in. Chantel, oblivious to the approaching men, was still complaining to the ticketing agent about the unacceptable delay. She demanded to speak to a manager, threatening to have the woman fired for ruining her baby moon. She was so absorbed in her own entitlement that she did not even notice the two federal agents until they were standing directly behind her husband. Spencer Hayes. One of the agents asked, his voice low, authoritative and carrying a weight that silenced Chantel's complaints instantly. Spencer swallowed hard, unable to form a single word. He slowly nodded, his hands trembling uncontrollably at his sides. The agent did not hesitate. He reached out and firmly grasped Spencer's shoulder, spinning him around to face the crowd. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and interstate flight to avoid prosecution," the agent stated loudly enough for the surrounding travelers to hear. The second agent smoothly pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. He grabbed Spencer's wrists, pulling them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the cuffs locking into place echoed sharply in the quiet space that had suddenly formed around them. People in the terminal stopped what they were doing and turned to stare. Travelers pulled out their phones to record the scene. Chantel let out a blood-curdling scream of pure, absolute horror. Her designer sunglasses slipped down her nose, revealing eyes wide with shock and panic. "What are you doing?" she shrieked, grabbing the agent's arm. "Let go of him. Do you know who we are? You cannot do this. He is a respected businessman. We are going on a baby moon." The agent looked at her with complete professional detachment. "Step back, Mom," he warned, stepping between her and Spencer. "Your husband is being taken into federal custody. If you interfere with an arrest, you will be detained as well." Spencer did not look at her. He did not try to defend himself. He just stared at the floor, his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. The illusion of the wealthy financial genius was completely destroyed in front of hundreds of strangers. He was just a common criminal in handcuffs. The agents began to walk him away, guiding him forcefully through the crowd of whispering, staring onlookers. They marched him toward the security exit, leaving a trail of public humiliation in their wake. Chantel was left standing completely alone at the first-class counter. The polished facade of the Golden Child was shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She looked around wildly, her face flushed crimson with a shame so deep it looked physically agonizing. The people in line were pointing at her, whispering about the pregnant woman whose husband was just dragged away by the FBI. She stood there trembling uncontrollably, holding onto the handle of her ridiculous luxury luggage. There was no yacht, no tropical beach, no escaping the ruin. There was only the cold, hard floor of the airport and the reality that she was entirely, utterly alone. I sat on the velvet sofa in my living room sipping a glass of iced water when Marcus texted me the confirmation. "Target secured. No incidents." I set the glass down on the coffee table and looked out at the city lights. My father was bankrupt and humiliated. My mother was facing tax fraud investigations. Spencer was sitting in the back of a federal vehicle in handcuffs. And Chantel was standing alone in an airport mourning the loss of the only thing she ever truly loved, which was her fake, unearned status. The absolute silence of my beautiful home was the greatest reward I could have ever asked for. The ledger was finally balanced. The very next morning, the illusion of the Hayes family was broadcast across every local news station in Prince George County. The federal indictments dropped like a massive bomb on their carefully curated social circle. I sat in my kitchen sipping hot tea while I watched the morning broadcast on the large flat-screen television. A reporter was standing live outside of my father's corporate headquarters. Behind her, agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation were carrying heavy cardboard boxes full of financial documents out the front doors and loading them into unmarked vans. The banner at the bottom of the screen read, "Local business mogul, Winston Hayes, under federal investigation for massive corporate fraud." It was a public execution of their reputation. The news anchors detailed how the untouchable elite family had been running a shell game for years. They talked about Spencer being arrested at Dulles International Airport while trying to flee the country with stolen corporate funds. They showed footage of Winston's bank accounts being frozen by federal order. The camera crew then moved to the Hayes estate. The sprawling mansion that had been the ultimate symbol of their superiority was crawling with authorities. I watched with absolute profound satisfaction as tow trucks pulled up the circular driveway and began hauling away Winston's luxury vehicles. The cars he loved more than his own daughter were being repossessed to pay off the mountains of hidden debt he had accumulated. But the most devastating blow was reserved for my mother. Brenda's face was plastered on the screen right below a headline about massive identity theft and credit fraud. The news anchor explained that a separate federal investigation had been launched into the matriarch of the family for allegedly stealing the identity of her youngest daughter to fund a lavish lifestyle. The untouchable family, that had spent decades looking down on everyone else, treating the working class like dirt, and stepping on anyone in their path, was finally exposed to the world. They were no longer the royalty of Prince George County. They were just a desperate collection of frauds and thieves whose house of cards had spectacularly collapsed. I watched the television screen as the local reporters interviewed former employees and minority shareholders. Uncle Terrence was on the screen looking tired but vindicated as he explained how the old management had nearly driven the legacy into the ground. The reporters talked about the massive IRS audit that had just been unsealed. They detailed how Winston had leveraged his own home to cover his massive debts and how the federal government was stepping in to liquidate his remaining personal assets. The sheer scale of the embezzlement was staggering, and the news anchors could not hide their shock. I knew it would not take long for reality to completely break them. They had no money, no credit, and no friends left to bail them out. The elite social circle they had sacrificed my mental health to impress dropped them instantly. Their country club memberships were revoked. Their dinner invitations were canceled. The very people who used to drink their expensive champagne were now gleefully sharing articles about their downfall on social media. It only took 3 days for them to show up at my door. I was sitting on the back patio of my new home in a private gated community. It was a beautiful, crisp morning. The air smelled like pine needles and fresh rain. The security guard at the main entrance called my personal line to tell me I had visitors. He said a man and 2 women were causing a massive disturbance and demanding to see me. They had somehow managed to tailgate another vehicle past the main neighborhood entrance, but they could not get past the heavy iron security gates that protected my personal driveway. I told the guard not to call the police just yet. I wanted to see this for myself. I walked down the long paved path, taking my time. The heavy iron bars of my driveway gate stood tall and imposing against the morning sky. Standing on the other side of the black metal were Winston and Brenda. Chantel was lingering a few steps behind them. They looked completely unrecognizable. The designer suits and expensive silk dresses were gone. They were wearing wrinkled basic clothing that looked like it had been slept in. The arrogant, dominating posture that used to define my father was completely broken. His broad shoulders were slumped and he looked like a hollow, defeated old man. The deep purple rage that usually colored his face was replaced by a sickly pale gray. Brenda was a shell of her former self. She was not wearing a single drop of makeup. Her hair, which was normally styled to absolute perfection, was flat and messy. Without the expensive cosmetics and the arrogant sneer, she just looked old and incredibly tired. The reality of facing federal prison had stripped away every ounce of her toxic glamour. Chantel stood behind them, clutching a cheap plastic purse instead of her usual designer bags. Her husband was sitting in a federal holding cell, and her entire fraudulent life had evaporated overnight. Desiree, Please, my father croaked, his voice shaking as his hands gripped the iron bars of my gate. You have to help us. The federal prosecutors are moving forward with the charges. The banks have seized the estate and locked us out. We had to sleep in a cheap motel last night. We have absolutely nothing left. I stood on my side of the gate, keeping my distance. I did not offer them a smile. I did not flinch at their desperate tone. I just watched them the same way they used to watch me when I was struggling to survive. My mother stepped forward and pressed her face against the iron bars. Tears were streaming down her face, and for the first time in my entire life, I knew they were not a performance. They were born of pure, absolute terror. Desiree, she sobbed, her voice cracking. They are threatening me with 10 years in federal prison for the credit cards. You have the money now, you took the company, and you have millions. Please, Desiree, you have to hire us a legal defense team. You have to drop the identity theft charges. We are begging you. We are your parents. I looked at the people who had made my existence a living nightmare. I looked at the woman who had stolen my financial future to buy shoes for her favorite daughter. I looked at the man who had watched his oldest child abuse me and done nothing but applaud her cruelty. Do you remember my birthday, Winston? I asked, my voice cold and perfectly calm. He blinked, clearly confused by the question. What? He stammered. Desiree, we do not have time for this. We are facing prison. I took a slow, deliberate step closer to the gate. Do you remember my birthday? I repeated, refusing to raise my voice. Do you remember when Chantel threw my cake on the floor and ruined my dress? You stood there and watched her do it. You watched me cry. And then you looked me dead in the eye and told me to pick it up and eat it off the floor. You told me that I was a disappointment. You told me that I was not truly part of this family. You told me that I was socially unfit and that I was nothing but a burden to the Hayes legacy. Winston opened his mouth to make a pathetic excuse, but I did not let him speak. I spent my entire life trying to earn a place at your table. I continued, the words flowing out of me like a cleansing river. I worked myself to the bone trying to make you proud. But you made it very clear that I was never family to you. I was just a punching bag. I was an inconvenience. I was a scapegoat for all of your failures and a bank account for your greed. You treated me like a stray dog that you could kick whenever you felt angry. Brenda let out a loud, dramatic wail, sliding down the iron bars until she was kneeling on the pavement. Please, Desiree. She wept. We made mistakes. We were wrong. Please do not let them lock me in a cage. I am your mother. You stopped being my mother the day you stole my identity, I told her, looking down at her kneeling figure. You sold my future so Chantel could play dress-up. And you, Winston, let a mediocre criminal steal your company blind because you were too arrogant to look at your own ledgers. You are both exactly where you deserve to be. I took a step back from the gate, the morning breeze rustling the leaves in the trees above us. I am simply honoring your wishes, I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. You told me I was not family, and I finally agree with you. I do not owe you a defense team. I do not owe you a single dime of the money I earned. I do not owe you loyalty or forgiveness or mercy. You built this nightmare with your own 2 hands, and now you get to live in it. I turned my back on them and began to walk up the long paved driveway toward my front door. The sound of my father begging and my mother wailing echoed behind me, but I did not slow my pace. My heart beat with a steady, calm rhythm. The heavy chains of seeking their approval had completely fallen away. I was light. I was free. Suddenly, Chantel rushed up to the iron gate. The sheer terror of her new reality finally broke through her lingering arrogance. Her face twisted with the same toxic bitterness she had carried her entire life. She wrapped her hands around the cold metal bars and screamed at my back. You are a monster, Desiree, she shrieked, her voice cracking with pure, desperate hatred. You have all that money and you have your little company, but you will always be alone. Nobody will ever truly love you because you are a cold, vicious witch. You are going to die alone in that big, empty house. I paused for a brief second, listening to her pathetic, desperate words. I remembered how those exact words used to cut me to the bone. I remembered how much I used to fear being alone. But the girl who feared loneliness was dead. She had been replaced by a woman who knew that solitude was a million times better than surviving in a house full of vipers. I did not turn around. I did not offer her a response. I did not need to defend my happiness to a woman who had just lost everything. I simply reached into the pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out the small black remote for the driveway gate. I pressed the heavy lock button. A loud electronic beep echoed through the morning air, followed by the heavy metallic click of the steel deadbolt sliding firmly into place. The gate was sealed, locking them out on the street where they belonged. I walked inside my beautiful, quiet home, closed the heavy oak door behind me, and left the Hayes family in the past forever. 6 months later, the absolute silence of my life was not just a temporary relief, it was a permanent state of peace. The local news cycle had moved on to other scandals, but the devastating consequences for my former family were absolute and inescapable. Winston and Brenda had been thoroughly evicted from the sprawling estate they loved more than their own children. They were now living in a cramped two-bedroom rental apartment on the outskirts of the city, drowning in a sea of insurmountable legal debt. Winston's arrogant strut was gone, replaced by the heavy shuffle of a man who had lost his kingdom to his own hubris. Brenda was currently navigating the humiliating reality of facing federal identity theft charges without the protective shield of expensive lawyers. She was just another common criminal waiting for her day in court. Chantel's fall from grace was perhaps the most spectacular of them all. The golden child was completely stripped of her unearned status. Spencer had immediately taken a federal plea deal the moment they placed him in an interrogation room. He happily threw Chantel and my parents under the bus to shave a few years off his prison sentence, and then he completely abandoned her. With her credit ruined, her husband incarcerated, and her trust fund exposed as stolen money, Chantel had no choice but to finally enter the real world. She was currently working as a front desk receptionist at a low-end medical clinic. She spent her days answering phones and filing paperwork wearing cheap scrubs, instead of designer silk, forced to smile at people she used to look down on. There were no more luxury vacations. There were no more country club dinners. There was only the exhausting reality of a life she had never been prepared to survive. Meanwhile, I was busy building an empire that was actually real. I had completely rebranded the logistics company, tearing out the toxic foundation my father had laid and replacing it with transparency and ethical business practices. Within 6 months, we were not just stable, we were massively profitable. I had paid back every single minority shareholder with interest and instituted a profit-sharing program for the employees who had kept the company running during my father's incompetent reign. I stood on the sprawling balcony of my new penthouse overlooking the glittering city skyline. The night air was warm and the sounds of laughter drifted out from my living room. I turned around and looked at the people gathered inside my home. Marcus, my brilliant lead counsel, was pouring a glass of wine for Uncle Terence, who was smiling wider than I had seen him smile in decades. My top executives, the mentors who had believed in my vision when I was just a struggling student, and the true friends who had supported me when I had absolutely nothing, were all sitting together. There was no anxiety in this room. There was no performance to maintain or walking on eggshells to avoid setting off a narcissistic rage. There was only genuine warmth and mutual respect. I walked back inside and made my way to the massive marble kitchen island. Sitting in the center was a beautifully decorated red velvet cake. It was perfect. The rich dark red sponge and the pristine white cream cheese frosting looked flawless under the warm pendant lights. I picked up a small silver fork and sliced a perfect piece onto a glass plate. I did not have to worry about someone snatching it away. I did not have to brace myself for a cruel insult or a sudden violent outburst. I stood in the center of my beautiful home, surrounded by the incredible people who had chosen to stand by my side. I looked down at the unblemished slice of red velvet cake and I took a slow, deliberate bite. It was sweet, rich, and absolutely perfect. It tasted like untainted victory. It tasted like freedom. I looked around the room at the smiling faces of the people I loved, and the truth finally settled into my soul with absolute clarity. Blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family. The most powerful lesson from this story is that blood alone does not define family. True family is built entirely on loyalty, respect, and unconditional support. When the people who are supposed to protect you choose to exploit you instead, walking away is not a betrayal. It is a necessary act of survival. Your worth is never determined by those who actively try to tear you down. Real peace only arrives when you find the courage to cut toxic ties and boldly build an authentic life on your own terms. Share your own experiences of setting hard boundaries with toxic relatives in the comments below, and hit the subscribe button for more empowering stories about reclaiming your strength.